Hello everybody and welcome to the SEND briefing for the 15th of March 2023. Today's briefing is going to focus on a notice about aid defenders, and then we're going to look at access arrangements as we have exams coming up. So here you can see the aid defenders that two of our students are going to be using, Nathaniel Sanderson and Abigail Licence. These are used where the young people have a hypersensitivity to noise, and they're called noise cancelling. So essentially what they do is they drown out all of the background noise, but you can still hear the teacher's voice. It's kind of like being underwater. We've told the students that they can only use the ones that are given to them by us, so that you'll be able to tell which ones students can and can't wear, and they look like the picture that is currently on the screen. You can then see our own wonderful Sam modelling a set for us. That's what they look like on the ears. So you'll be able to tell straight away that it's a young person who requires them to avoid the noise and oversensitivity. So on to access arrangements. Access arrangements are governed by the Joint Council for Qualifications, or JCQ. JCQ are a government quango that works with the awarding bodies to put in place the thresholds, the guidance and the guidelines around the use of access arrangements in schools for exams. We must follow this guidance, and we are inspected every year by JCQ to ensure that we're compliant, not just with the way that we're running exams, but with access arrangements. And they come in, they check the paperwork, they check everything's right, and they then work from there. The process for access arrangements begins in year 9. So around February half term, you should be raising any concerns with me about young people in year 9 that you think are going to need any kind of access arrangements in order to access GCSE examinations. Concerns can be raised by the young people themselves, they can be raised by parents. The process is always the same, it always begins with a concern. Then between Easter and the summer break, I'll be coming out to you and I will be asking for information. This will be done through a Google form. There are 3 text boxes on the Google form that I'm going to ask you to complete. These directly correlate to something called a Form 8, which is a JCQ document that must be filled in when we're applying for specific access arrangements. I take the information that you give me, I collate it and I place it onto the Form 8 so that when the inspector comes in, it's very clear what the needs are, what kind of things happen in classrooms to support these young people, and why we're looking to put these access arrangements in place. The JCQ guidance is updated every August, and this August, one of the big changes was this whole idea of relevant subjects. So the idea being that you could have extra time in all subjects or just some subjects. Relevant subjects essentially means where it's needed. So if I don't get information back from individual subject teachers, by the guidance, that wouldn't be a relevant subject where an access arrangement would need to be put into place. So it may be that if that information doesn't come back to me through the Google form, I can't put access arrangements in place in your subjects. That's why it's so important that that information comes back to me. I only need a sentence in each box. It doesn't have to be a massive essay, but it's that information that I can then use to say, this is why this young person needs it, and this is why this young person needs it in the summer. Once all that information is collated, I then need to do some standardised testing. If the standardised testing comes out at certain levels and below certain thresholds between May half term and the summer, I then make the application to access arrangements online, and it's decided by JCQ whether those arrangements can go ahead. Really, all access arrangements should be in place at the end of year 9. When you make an application for access arrangements, it gives you an end date, and that end date is 26 months from application. That's the way we do it at the end of year 9. It should be very rare and very exceptional circumstances that we are looking to put access arrangements in year 11 and year 13. And usually it's where something has happened over the course of the GCSEs that means that they now require access arrangements in order to access the papers. So it may be that you get some final concerns following the year 10 PPEs or the final year 11 PPEs where something's changed, something's happened, something's not where it used to be. At which point we go back into the same process. So you'd alert me, I then go out to staff and ask for information, testing would happen, and we'll make the application. JCQ set a final deadline, which is usually around the 20th of March. After that date, we are not able to apply for any further access arrangements for examinations. The reason being, access arrangements must always be the normal way of working for a young person. So if a young person has 25% extra time, they should get that in classwork. in every lesson. They should get that in assessments every time. They should get that in exams every time. So it should be a normal way of working. What you cannot and what you are not allowed to do is put access arrangements in place just before the Year 11 exams. However, as you can see, the next bullet point there talks about the exam season. Now, we can put emergency arrangements in place. If a young person falls over and breaks their arm and can't write, then we could look to give them a Chromebook, we could look to give them some other kind of support to be able to complete those exams and assessments. But that is in a complete emergency where something goes wrong or something happens at the time of the exams. If you have a young person that has a literacy difficulty, if you have a young person that has ADHD and requires a prompt or something like that, that must be in place at the end of Year 9 and go through the entire GCSE period. So I thought this would then be a good opportunity to go through some of the main access arrangements that we use in the school. For a young person to have access arrangements, they must have some form of special educational need or disability, and therefore it must conform to the Equalities Act of 2010. You cannot put access arrangements in place just because a young person wants it. So, for example, you can't give a young person a laptop just because they want to type. There has to be a need and a reason to do that. It also has to be, as I said earlier, the normal way of working. It's also worth noting that access arrangements are not a magic bullet. Just because they get extra time or the use of a word processor, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to tip into the next grade boundary. The whole point of an access arrangement is so that they can access the paper in the same way that their peers can and show what they can do. Just giving them extra time doesn't necessarily mean they're going to tip over into the next grade boundary. And all arrangements have pros and all arrangements have cons, and that's what I'm going to go through with you here. So let's begin with extra time. Extra time is generally 25%. That essentially means that for every hour of an examination, they get an additional 15 minutes. So if you have a 2-hour exam, that means that they have 2.5 hours to complete it. This is based around either standardised testing results, so 2 scores around speed of working at a standardised score of 84 or less. That can be speed of reading, speed of handwriting, or speed of processing. So you need to do the 3 tests, and if 2 out of the 3 have a standardised score of 84 or below, then we can use that as evidence to put forward extra time. We can also use unfinished papers, unfinished assessments, things like that, to build an evidence base to again show why that young person requires that access arrangement. It may also be that a young person has a medical condition, so something like joint hypermobility or some kind of other physical disability, which means that they need that extra time in order to be able to form letters, to write sentences, whatever that may be. Now, there are some cons to 25% extra time. If you have a young person, for example, with ADHD, asking them to sit in an exam hall for 2 hours is quite a big ask. Asking them to sit in an exam hall for 2.5 hours is an even bigger ask, and it therefore may not be suitable in those kinds of cases. Equally, if you have an exam in the morning, you have an exam in the afternoon, it's going to shorten the break time. So if you have an English exam that begins at 9 in the morning and finishes at 11:30 and the next one starts at 1 o'clock, if they have an extra 40 minutes, that's going to take 40 minutes out of that break time. So again, students and parents and yourselves need to be aware that we don't push back the start time of the next exam. We're not allowed to. That's a national exam that has to begin at that time. It just cuts the amount of break time they have. So again, if you've got a condition such as ADHD, then it may be that the extra time would disadvantage because they haven't got the break that they need in order to be able to regulate. There's also something called supervised rest breaks. Now, supervised rest breaks may be better for somebody with ADHD, for an example, because what they can do is they can take a break during the exam. They give the invigilator a signal, or they tell the invigilator that actually they need to stop for a bit. The paper is taken away from them, and they're allowed time to get themselves back into a position where they're able to carry on with the paper. Because the clock is stopped, it can make an exam go on ad infinitum, which again reduces the gap if you've got 2 exams within a day. That can cause problems. If a young person needs to leave the venue, then they need to be escorted at all times to ensure that they're not accessing a phone or a mobile device or talking to somebody about the paper. Equally, the other issue with supervised rest breaks is that a young person, once they take that supervised rest break, if they take too long, it can take them even longer to get back into the mode of working, and therefore can be counterproductive. So again, it's understanding that yes, there are some really good things around supervised rest breaks, that they can stop, they can re-regulate, they can ground, they can get themselves back into a position where they can access the paper again and continue to work. But it can have its cons in terms of it will make the exam go on longer, it will shorten any break that they have, and it can take them a bit more time to get back in place. Supervised rest breaks would generally be used where you have a young person who has a condition such as ADHD, where they will need a break, where there are any kind of social, emotional, and mental health difficulties, where again they're going to need some kind of break to re-regulate high levels of diagnosed anxiety, not just standard anxiety for an exam, because let's be honest, we all feel a bit anxious when we walk into an exam hall. It has to be something that is very high level, and usually we would be looking for something that is also medically backed. So we'd have something from a therapist, a doctor, a CAMS worker, a psychotherapist, something like that, that says this young person's anxiety is at such a level that it's much higher than everybody else's. So on to live readers and reader pens. We generally use reader pens in the school. The reason for that is a live reader, so somebody sitting there reading a paper, is not allowed to read anything that tests reading. So parts of the English language paper, parts of MFL papers, anything that tests reading, a live reader is not able to read it. The reason for that is that they can add inflection, they can add prosody, which can then give the candidate a hint about sections that they need to use within the question and their answer. This would then give them an advantage, and the whole point of access arrangements is not to give an advantage, it's to ensure that young people can access the paper in line with their peers. That's the reason we use reader pens. Reader pens you can use in extracts of test reading, so you can use them in MFL, you can use them in English language, because they read in a very robotic voice, so there's no prosody, there's no inflection. A reader pen essentially looks like a kind of highlighter. You plug some earphones on it, you drag it along the page, and it reads it to you. It gives the candidate independence about what it is they want read. The use of a reader pen, we'd be looking for young people who have very low reading scores, young people who are unable to access the reading parts of the papers because of their low fluency or their low reading speed or their low reading comprehension, that need that additional support in terms of actually hearing the text. Reader pens are absolutely fantastic. Some students do find them a little bit difficult to work with at the start because they are, like I say, very robotic. However, the fact that they can use them within those sections of text that test reading obviously makes them much better to use than a live reader. Another exam arrangement you can look at is the use of a smaller venue. Now, some students will turn around and say that they want a separate venue, they want to be on their own. We don't recommend this for use as a school. The reason being, if you put them in completely separate invigilation, they have to sit there in a room with an invigilator on their own. So essentially what you've then got is an invigilator looking at the candidate for the entirety of the exam, and students, when they actually do it, find that that can be quite uncomfortable. Whereas if you're in a smaller venue with other candidates, actually you've not quite got that intensity with that other person. In order to have the arrangement to go into a smaller venue, you must have some kind of diagnosed condition or some kind of knowledge in the school of SEMH. We may also sometimes use it for young people who have hearing impairments, where a larger venue like the sports hall might cause echoes and bounce as people are moving around. For young people who have noise sensitivity, so clacking of desks on uneven floors, things like that. Again, it's not a choice. You can't just choose to be in the smaller venue. And if you're saying that the young person has a social, emotional and mental health need in terms of anxiety, for example, it needs to be an anxiety level that is much higher than the usual exam anxiety that we all feel whenever we go into a test. Generally, the small venue that we use is the hall. I know that kind of sounds a little bit counterproductive, but small venue essentially means fewer students. It's not necessarily the venue that you put them into, and the hall works incredibly well for these candidates because of the system that we have in terms of where they put their bags, how they come in. It tends to be regular staff in there that they get to know, that they feel confident and comfortable with. Again, I'm going to say it, this isn't something that a student can just choose. You can't just say, I want to go in the smaller venue because I don't like exams and I think I'll do better in there. It doesn't work like that. There's got to be some kind of diagnosed condition or some knowledge in the school, either by myself as a Senko, by one of the YPLs or so on, that says this young person has a level of anxiety that is much higher than anything you would find in terms of a normal exam anxiety. So another one that I get asked about, and another one that we use a lot of word processors. Now, we are a Google school, and we encourage all of our young people to purchase Chromebooks for use at home, and digital weeks and technology are very much a part of what we do. However, there are again thresholds and guidelines around the way that a word processor can be used, and you would use a word processor where a young person has a legible handwriting. Whenever I ask for a sample of handwriting, that's what I'm looking at. I am an experienced examiner. I was an examiner for many, many years, and it's amazing what an examiner can read. That's one of the reasons I will ask for a copy of the handwriting to see if it is illegible. It can also be used where a young person has very slow handwriting speed, but they have a higher typing speed. Now, that is the really important bit here. They've got to be proficient typers, hence the reason it's got to be a normal way of working. If you've got a young person with a typing speed that is slower than their handwriting speed, giving them a word processor is actually a disadvantage because they're not going to produce as much content, therefore could potentially miss out on grade boundaries. Any word processor that's given must be provided by us as a school. They are not allowed to use their own devices. They are not allowed to use their own Chromebooks. It must be provided by the school because it must be clean. There can be nothing saved on it. There's got to be there's very clear guidance and very clear structures around internet access and what they can and what, more importantly, they can't do, i.e. they can't get on the internet, so they can't copy and paste anything. That's the reason we have our own bank of Chromebooks that we use, because they have all of those features disabled. You cannot have a spell check on it. So if you've got a young person that has very poor spelling, this isn't a way to overcome that. If you have a spell check enabled, it means that they lose all of the SPAG marks for the exam. That can mean the difference between a grade boundary. We all know that 1 mark can mean the difference between a grade boundary, and losing those SPAG marks could be the difference between a grade. So, we need to be very aware of that. And I'll say it again, it cannot be a choice. It must be to level the playing field. It must be so that the young person can access and show what they can do, rather than, I prefer to type, so can I use a Chromebook in an exam. I'm also going to mention scribes here, because a lot of people speak to me about scribes. A scribe is a responsible adult that writes down a young person's exam answer. Now, scribes are very, very difficult things to use. First of all, they have to be a normal way of working. That means somebody must be scribing for them in lessons, somebody must be scribing for them in every assessment, and somebody must be scribing for them in every exam. In order to qualify for the SPAG marks with a scribe, a young person will have to dictate everything to the scribe, which includes spelling, tier 2 and 3 vocabulary, subject-specific terminology, and saying to the scribe, end of sentence, new sentence, full stop here, capital letter here, that word needs an apostrophe, end sentence, new paragraph, capital letter. So it's something that is a very, very difficult thing to use, hence the reason it must be a normal way of working. The scribe must also ensure that they are writing what comes out of the young person's mouth. They can't change it, they can't paraphrase it, they can't do anything. So it's a real skill. And if somebody had a scribe, it would essentially mean that the teacher would have to sit next to that young person and scribe for them in every single lesson, which again is not necessarily something that is going to be in that young person's best interest moving forward. They're not going to get that when they leave us and they go into the world of work. That's the reason we use word processors over scribes, because actually using a scribe is a very difficult thing to do, and in some cases, in many cases, can actually impede a young person. Another arrangement that parents and staff will often talk to me about is a prompt. A prompt is used where you have somebody with, for example, ADD or ADHD, or there is a social, emotional, mental health condition, which means that they find long periods of concentration difficult. And a prompt can be somebody that notices this and prompts them back to the paper. And the way this is done is either through a tap on the desk or a tap on the arm. A prompt is literally there to do that, to basically prompt them back to the paper. A prompt can't tell them when to change question. A prompt can't tell them that you're running out of time, so you need to move on to the next question. A prompt can't say, you've done 10 minutes on question 1, so you now need to do 12 minutes on question 2. They are not allowed to do that. They are literally allowed to tap the desk, tap the arm so that the focus is back on the paper again. And it's really important that the pros and cons and the way that these things work are explained to you as staff, but also to parents and students, because very often what parents, students, and in some cases staff think these arrangements are not. So that's another reason I've wanted to go through some of these pros and cons with you in this presentation. So just to be clear and just to recap a few things, access arrangements are governed by JCQ and we must follow their thresholds and guidelines. We will be inspected on it, they will look at it. This is one of the reasons that I will always stand up in a briefing before a parents' evening, or say in the Hof's briefing on a Tuesday morning, if we have a parents' evening coming up, and that can be any year group throughout the school. If a parent mentions access arrangements, please refer them to me. Please do not have that discussion, and please do not recommend any access arrangements. Comments like, well, if they had extra time, they could possibly have got a few more marks, or comments like, well, their handwriting can be a little bit difficult to read, so maybe they need a word processor. If they don't hit those thresholds, then they cannot have it. And that then leads to a very difficult conversation with the parent around, well, actually, you know what? They don't hit that threshold. And I don't want us as a school to be placed into that situation. Access arrangements are not there to give an advantage, they're there to ensure a level playing field. They're there to ensure that young people who have special needs and disabilities, as per the Equalities Act of 2010, can show what they can do in an exam and can access that paper in line with their peers. It cannot and must not give an advantage, and it cannot and must not be put in place because it's a student preference. A laptop must only be used where handwriting is illegible or where there is an issue with handwriting speed and you may want to look at using a laptop because typing speed is higher. It can't be the case that, well, actually I prefer to type, so can I have a laptop? I'm sorry, but the answer will be no. And that laptop must be their normal way of working. It must be used in lessons. It must be used for homework. It must be something that has already happened. Please do not allow young people to have any kind of access arrangement lower down in the school without informing me. Please don't give them extra time. Please don't give them a laptop. Please don't read things to them without having a conversation with me or a member of the team first, just so we've got a very clear idea of what's going on. Because again, it can lead to very difficult conversations in year 11 where a parent will say to me, but the teacher always reads that to them. And I have no understanding or no idea that that's going on. Again, I'd need to test, and if they don't hit certain thresholds, then that arrangement wouldn't be allowed to happen in an exam, and therefore overall would disadvantage in a candidate. So please, please, please come and speak to us. Let us know your concerns. Let us know what's happening, and we can always have a conversation from there. We all want what's in the best interest of our young people, and we all want our young people to shine, and we all want them to leave us with the best set of qualifications that they can possibly have. But we've got to ensure that we're following that guidance and we're following those guidelines. So please come and speak to me. Remember the team if you've got any questions or concerns around access arrangements or young people, and we will do our best to help. Thank you for your attention.